Tony Blair has been giving evidence at the inquiry into the Iraq War. The former Prime Minister rejected claims that he struck a private deal with American President George Bush 11 months before the invasion. But he did admit that he pledged British backing to America if military action was needed to overthrow Saddam Hussein.
You would have been hard pushed to have found virtually anybody who doubted he had WMD and a WMD capability and program, because we'd been through this whole saga, 10 years of military action. As I say, I took the first military action in respect of Baghdad with President Clinton in 1998. So it wasn't that so much. And incidentally, I just point out that in the statement with the dossier, which I think, to be frank, it was the statement people would have heard rather than the forward, I actually say specifically, why now, people ask. I agree, I cannot say that this month or next, even this year or next, Saddam will use his weapons. Inside the inquiry room, Blair's evidence is being scrutinised by the family members of service personnel who died during the conflict. But outside, his appearance was greeted by protesters. Student Rachel Boothroyd explains why they're there.
I just think it's extremely important to show that this war hasn't been forgotten by people in Britain, and that people who, did vote for us, and particularly Tony Blair, in this country, they need to be held accountable for what they've done, because up to 1 million people have died, and we're not going to forget that anytime soon. For me, what had happened after September the 11th was that I was starting to look at this whole issue to do with this unrepresentative extremism within Islam in a different way, and I wanted to persuade President Bush, but also to get a sense from him as to where he was on that broader issue.
So what you're suggesting is that you were having general discussions in terms of getting the views across to each other, trying to understand and establish a rapport and a relationship.
Yeah, but also, frankly, from his...
But during the course of these discussions, do you think you gave him any commitments?
The only commitment I gave, and I gave this very openly at the meeting, was a commitment to deal with Saddam. Now,
so you were at one that you had to deal with...
Absolutely, and that wasn't a private commitment, that was a public commitment.
So you were agreed on the end, but not on the means?
We were agreed on both, actually, as it came to finally, but we were agreed that we had to confront this issue, that Saddam had to come back into compliance with the international community, and as I think I said in the press conference with President Bush, the method of doing that is open, and indeed he made the same point. I just wanted to make one other point about this. This was about 6 months from September the 11th. And one major part of what President Bush was saying to me was just to express his fear, actually, that if we weren't prepared to act in a really strong way, then we ran the risk of sending a disastrous signal out to the world.
But there is... so many people believe that you entered into a firm commitment because some undertakings were given that you will be with him no matter what, whatever the circumstances. I mean, I think it's important because these discussions were taking place without anybody being present to understand what commitments did you make to him, and why is there a feeling that this was quite a critical meeting? Well,
I honestly, I can't explain why people have come to a view that there was some different commitment given, because I read from time to time people saying things that this is what was agreed at this meeting. What was agreed was actually set out in a very private note from David Manning afterwards. And what I was saying to President Bush, and I wasn't saying this privately, incidentally, I was saying it publicly, was we are going to be with you in confronting and dealing with this threat. Up to September the 11th, Saddam was still a problem, a major problem. The sanctions framework was eroding. There were continual breaches of the no-fly zone. We were actually worried about enforcing the no-fly zone. You've probably seen, I think, correspondence from Robin Cook at the time to me about that. There was an attempt to put in place a different form of sanctions, these so-called smart sanctions, and perhaps we can come to that in detail a little later. And, of course, the very first military action I'd taken was with President Clinton back in 1998 against Saddam.
And we'll come back to that later, too.
And that's actually a very important moment as well. But, however, I think I would fairly describe our policy up to September the 11th as doing our best, hoping for the best, but with a different calculus of risk assessment. In other words, up to September the 11th, we thought he was a risk, but we thought it was worth trying to contain it. The crucial thing after September the 11th is that the calculus of risk changed.
I'll come on to that in just a minute. But in the period up to September the 11th, effectively, would it be right to say that containment as a broad strategy had been effective, was still sustainable, needed reinforcing, was expensive and difficult? That's roughly speaking what we've heard from some earlier witnesses, including Sir John Sawers, who was working for you at the time. He said, I think it was working, but the costs of it were quite high and there were risks to the various elements of our policy that we wanted to reduce. Would that be a fair summary?
I think the way I would put it is this, that the sanctions were obviously eroding. We couldn't get support for them. This so-called smart sanctions framework, we actually, prior to September the 11th, couldn't get support for at that time.
Yep.
So we were in a bit of a difficulty there. And of course, the fact is that Saddam, as I say, we'd taken military action in 1998. There is a very long history, of course, of the dealings with Saddam. One of the things I've done for the purpose of the inquiry is go back through my speeches prior to September the 11th. And I mean, I've actually got one or two of them here, but it's just quite interesting.
I want to refer back to one or two of them later on, as I'm sure colleagues will.
Well, let me summarise their impact then. Their impact is regularly through 1997, 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001, I am saying Saddam must comply with the UN resolutions and force as an option. But all of this, frankly, was in circumstances where this wasn't the top priority for us. And I remember at the very first meeting that we had, myself and President Bush, in February 2001, just after he had come to power as President of the United States, we dealt with Iraq with Colin Powell, but it was very much in the context of trying to get a different sanctions framework in place.
The protesters kept up their demonstration throughout Mr. Blair's evidence, though he's unlikely to have taken much notice.
There was no sorry, no act of contrition. As he rose to leave, shouted, "You are a liar and a murderer." He clearly disputes that assessment. Tony Blair still believes what he did was right, and in the same circumstances, he said he would do it all over again.
Why didn't you say sorry today, Mr. Blair?